further enriched them and brought them to the required level of 93% of enriched uranium. And it also has succeeded already in developing or enriching to the level of 20%, some of it. But they need to enrich all of it to the level of 93% in order to be able to have material for bombs. So this is the stage of the uranium route. They also have a plutonium route, which is much less developed, but they are working on it. This is in Iraq. I mentioned the Natas. There is another factory in Iraq which is aimed at the plutonium route. Incidentally, the Bushehr facility is indeed for peaceful uses, not for military uses. Bushehr facility was, of course, helped, aided, built partly by Russia. And it's still, Russia is supplying it. So this is the picture of the Iranian nuclear program. There have been efforts to halt this development by the international community. And these started already in 2003, 2004, and there was the European initiative. I don't want to go into the details because of the shortage of time. There were several efforts, there were several agreements, but by 2005, in fact, Iran abrogated all the agreements and began the process of enrichment at full speed, or at least at the speed that they could do technically. And there are technical limitations what the Iranians are doing. It's not a very easy project. So this is as far as the technical side of the Iranian project is considered. That is to say, we have an advanced enrichment program. We have a parallel plutonium, but much more slowly. And we have a weapons group that develops the missilery and is, according to some evidence, is working also on the design of warheads for the missilery. What is the... I'll switch to the current Obama administration policy vis-a-vis Iran. Obama has tried a more open approach towards Iran, some kind of a more accommodating approach towards Iran. This has not worked too well. By now, the American administration is adopting a parallel approach, two pillars. On the one hand, a diplomatic effort to negotiate and to conduct a positive dialogue with Iran. On the other hand, the imposition of economic sanctions on Iran, because the feeling, the assessment has been, and I agree with this assessment, that without a policy of both pressure and negotiations and dialogue, the Iranian project will continue and Iran will eventually become a nuclear weapons power. The Obama administration also mentioned the military option as possibly on the table, but it insists on trying the double approach that I have mentioned, diplomacy and sanctions, economic sanctions. And one must remember that indeed the Obama administration succeeded in mobilizing also the support of Russia and China to the economic sanctions in the Security Council, which was quite an effort on the part of the administration, American administration. Now, if Iran, let me just reflect very quickly on what I call seeds of instability if Iran becomes a nuclear power. And this has to do with, let's assume, let's speculate on a situation which I sincerely hope will not materialize, of Iran becoming a nuclear weapons power. Then we might have, not might have, we will have an Israeli-Iranian nuclear relationship. And the question is, basically, would it be stable or unstable? So we have, this is the main issue that I think one has to consider from an Israeli point of view, but not only Israeli point of view, but international point of view, if Iran becomes a nuclear power. This, apart from its coercive political implications for the Gulf country, Arab Gulf countries. And as I mentioned before, I must re-emphasize it, Egyptians and what I hear from them and Gulf countries are very fearful about the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear power. Now, from the Israeli point of view, if we look at an Israeli-Iranian nuclear relationship, it's not from the Israeli point of view. From my own academic, sort of somebody who has been interested in nuclear affairs, nuclear strategy, and so on for quite some time, I've written something about it, several things about it. I've compared it, incidentally, to the superpower relationship during the Cold War, and also to the Indian-Pakistani relationship, nuclear relationship, and I've tried to compare the three systems of deterrence between the three pairs of powers. But let me go directly to a possible potential Israeli-Iranian nuclear relationship. The first thing I would like to say is that the idea that has had some support, both in Israel and outside, that if Iran becomes a nuclear power, it might launch out of the blue a devastating nuclear strike against Israel as a first strike. I don't share this view. In other words, it seems to me that even an irrational regime in many different ways, and sometimes when I hear Ahmadinejad talking about the world and about Iran and about Israel, there is a feeling that irrational elements within him. I remind you of when he came back from the United Nations, his first visit to the United Nations, he talked about his listening to direct messages from God Almighty during his speech at the United Nations, and he felt there is a halo of light around his head. So when you hear such things, then you feel a little bit awkward. Nevertheless, I don't believe that the Iranian regime will do that. I think they will recognize that such a strike will result in the devastation of Iran. I think this is something they should recognize. What I'm worried about, and I think this is cause for concern, major concern, are several other things. And here I borrow from the experience of the superpowers, to a certain extent the Indian-Pakistani experience and so on. I mean, there are several dimensions or aspects of nuclear relationship or deterrence nuclear relationships that are very important in order to have stable relationships. One of them, I would posit, is understanding the nature of nuclear weapons, that they are really weapons of a totally different category than anything else, even of other types of WMD, of chemical and biological ones. This has been a lesson that has been learned by many, many leaders, for instance, in the United States, the Soviet Union, and other leaders around the world. But this is something which develops with a kind of process of socialization of leaders, regimes, societies in the nature of nuclear weapons. And I'm not sure that Iran, or the leadership of Iran, has undergone this socialization. To be quite frank, sometimes I meet Israeli politicians, and when I start talking with them, I find quite a lot of ignorance about the realities of nuclear power, nuclear weapons, not nuclear power. But I'm confident, I can say it from personal knowledge, that there is a group of high-level officials, decision makers in Israel that have already familiarized themselves and internalized the what are nuclear weapons? What is the meaning of nuclear weapons? So socialization is a very important factor, and this requires a lot of time. And if there are nuclear weapons in Iran before this process sits in, then this is a difficult situation. There are other issues that are related to more technical, but not only technical, elements or dimensions. For instance, second strike capability, which is widely recognized as a necessary precondition for a stable deterrence relationship. There is the problem of command and control. There is the problem of how you behave under a situation of crisis. Even in the United States and in the Soviet Union, even in the 80s, after such a long experience in nuclear relationships, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the dozens and hundreds of books and articles and discussions and studies about it, still there was concern in both places about how to behave under crisis situations and how to control nuclear capabilities and so on. There were several important initiatives in the 80s that were initiated, for instance, by the Lugar ideas and so on, about understandings and creating systems of understandings with the Soviet Union about mutual nuclear relationships. So you need a lot of dialogue between sides if they have nuclear weapons. If you don't have dialogue, if you don't have understandings about red lines, about crisis behavior and so on, nuclear weapons could be quite dangerous. I have several other factors. I don't want to belabor the points because I'm sure many of you might have comments and questions and so on, so I would like to end very quickly my lecture. Let me add one thing, or several things. One, the Middle East, as you all know, is a highly turbulent and conflictual region. If you introduce nuclear weapons into such a region, then it might not stabilize the region, but rather the other way around. In addition, there is all the time the danger of crisis, which might escalate into conventional war, and conventional war might escalate into nuclear exchanges. In addition, in the case of Iran, Iran is sponsoring two sub-state organizations, military organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas, and they might behave in what an American strategist, Amon Katz, I remember many years ago, called catalytic war, catalytic behavior. That is to say, provoke some kind of crisis and confrontation between the powers, the states, through low-level violence, terrorism, and the hope that doing that that Israel will constrain from reacting because of the possibility of an Iranian intervention, the possibility of an Israeli-Iranian nuclear exchange. So that you have a situation which is not just pure state-to-state, but also other factor sub-state organizations are involved.